The moment I slid the keys across the table, a broad smile stretched across my face, anticipation bubbling in my chest as I waited for their reaction, expecting the kind of joy that comes when someone receives a gift they never saw coming. I had spent years planning this, saving meticulously, searching for the perfect place, imagining the looks on their faces when I told them that after decades of hard work, after all the sacrifices they had made to raise me and my brother, they finally had a place to escape, a retreat that belonged to them and no one else. The house was everything they had ever talked about, a breathtaking vacation home nestled near the lake, with wide windows that let in the morning sun, a wraparound porch perfect for evening tea, and just enough distance from the city to make the air feel cleaner, crisper, lighter. I had pictured my mother sitting in the cozy reading nook by the window, my father out on the deck grilling steaks, both of them at peace, surrounded by the life they had built together. I had expected tears, hugs, disbelief, gratitude. What I had not expected was the slow, casual way my father picked up the keys, turning them over in his hands as if they were nothing more than a set to some rental car he had borrowed for the weekend. I had not expected my mother's thin smile, the way she placed her napkin on her lap and barely glanced at the small envelope containing the deed, as if it were just another piece of mail. I had not expected the words that came next, spoken so simply, so offhandedly, that it took me a moment to even process what they meant. "Well, this is really nice of you," my father said, his voice calm, steady, matter-of-fact, the same way he had sounded when he used to tell me I had left the porch light on or forgotten to close the fridge properly. "But your brother could really use a place like this. He has a family to take care of after all, and you're just one person. You don't need all this space." At first, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe he was joking, that maybe in just a few seconds he would laugh and tell me that of course they were grateful, of course they loved the house, of course they would cherish this gift because it came from me, because it was meant for them, because it was a symbol of everything I had worked so hard to give back to them. But then I glanced across the table at my mother, waiting for her to correct him, waiting for her to tell him how ridiculous that sounded, waiting for her to put a hand on mine and say, "Sweetheart, this is too much, but we love it and we love you." Instead, she simply nodded, reaching for her water glass with the same ease as if we were discussing the weather, as if my father's words were nothing more than an obvious, logical conclusion. "She's right, dear," my mother added, her tone soft, patient, as if explaining something to a child who couldn't quite grasp the way the
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
world worked. Eric has a wife, 2 kids, and another on the way. You know how hard things have been for them lately, how much they've struggled. A home like this could be life-changing for them, a real opportunity to have something stable. A slow, hollow feeling spread through my chest, a dull ache that sat heavy in my stomach, twisting tighter with each passing second. My hands, which had been resting on the table just moments ago, curled into fists in my lap, hidden beneath the white tablecloth, nails pressing into my palm just to ground myself, just to keep from saying something I wouldn't be able to take back. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my ears, the sharp, creeping realization that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, that this wasn't some moment of miscommunication that could be smoothed over with a few clarifying words. They weren't asking if I would consider giving it to Eric. They weren't thanking me first, acknowledging the effort, the thought, the love behind this gift before suggesting an alternative plan. They had already decided. Eric, who had been sitting silently across from me, finally spoke, his voice completely devoid of any embarrassment, any hesitation, any gratitude. "Yeah, this will be great for the kids," he said, already pocketing the keys as if the decision had never belonged to me in the first place. "They'll love having the extra space, and Megan has been talking about wanting a second home for a while now. This really works out perfectly." And that was it. That was all he had to say, as if the house had always belonged to him, as if I had been nothing more than the messenger delivering his next big win, as if my only purpose had been to provide for him the way my parents always had, the way they always would, because in their eyes, he was the one who mattered more. I wanted to say something, to protest, to laugh bitterly at the sheer absurdity of what was happening, to remind them that this wasn't their gift to give away, that I was the one who had bought it. I was the one who had spent years making sure I could afford something special for them. I was the one who had dreamed of seeing them happy in a place that was theirs, not his. But my throat felt tight. The words stuck somewhere between anger and heartbreak, too raw to force out, too heavy to lift. So instead, I just sat there, my face carefully blank, my breathing slow and controlled, willing myself to stay calm, to not let them see just how deeply they had cut me. I let them talk, let them move on, let them carry on as if this had always been the plan, as if I had never been a factor in this equation at all. I nodded when I needed to, sipped my drink when I couldn't trust myself to speak, smiled just enough to keep them from asking questions. And the whole time, a single thought kept repeating over and over again in my mind, a quiet whisper growing louder with each passing second. This isn't over. The days after that disastrous dinner passed in a strange blur, each moment feeling like I was walking through water, everything slowed down, muffled, distant, like I was watching my own life from behind a thick pane of glass. I went through the motions of my routine, answering emails, attending meetings, making polite conversation with coworkers who had no idea that something inside me had cracked wide open, leaving a hollow space where certainty used to be. Every time my phone buzzed with a family group message about Christmas plans or updates on Eric's kids, I found myself staring at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, torn between responding like nothing had changed and finally saying the words I had swallowed for years. But I didn't type anything, didn't say anything, didn't let on that I had spent every single night since that dinner replaying the moment over and over again in my mind, dissecting every detail, searching for some explanation that would make it hurt less. But the explanation was simple, really, and it had been there all along, written between the lines of a lifetime of smaller disappointments, of moments where I had been overlooked, dismissed, expected to understand that my place in the family was always going to be different. They had never seen me as someone who needed things for herself, never believed that my successes, my efforts, my contributions were as valuable as Eric's, because in their eyes, I was always secondary, always an accessory to someone else's life, always the one who was supposed to step aside when something or someone more important came along. I tried to tell myself it wasn't worth thinking about, that I had known the truth for years and had simply chosen to ignore it, but the bitter sting of it wouldn't leave me, not when every single moment seemed to be designed to remind me of exactly where I stood. The first time I saw Megan's post on social media, I nearly dropped my phone, my stomach twisting at the sight of her standing in my house, grinning as she held up swatches of fabric, the caption beneath the photo reading, "Big things coming. Can't wait to make this place feel like home." I stared at the screen for a long time, my pulse slow and heavy, my hands tightening around the phone, the realization settling in deeper than before. It wasn't just that they had taken the house. It was that they hadn't even paused to consider what that meant for me. They had already moved on, already started making it theirs, already erased me from the equation entirely. A few days later, I found myself at another family gathering, a casual Sunday barbecue in my parents' backyard, where everyone laughed and chatted like nothing had happened, like my name hadn't just been crossed out of the history of that house, like my feelings were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be brushed aside. I had debated skipping it entirely, had spent the morning sitting in my car, parked just a few blocks away, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror and wondering why I was even bothering to show up at all. But some stubborn part of me, some piece of me that wasn't quite ready to walk away completely, had convinced me to go, to listen, to see for myself if there was still any part of this family that considered me an equal. I had barely been there for 20 minutes when I heard Eric's voice rise above the chatter, his tone smug, self-satisfied, completely unaware of my presence as he spoke to a few of my father's friends near the grill. "Yeah, it all worked out perfectly," he was saying, his words carrying easily across the yard, sharp and clear despite the clatter of dishes and the distant sound of children playing in the background. "Mom and Dad gave us the house, and honestly, we deserve it, after everything we've done. Megan's already got some amazing plans for the place. It's gonna be great for the kids." Something inside me snapped, something small but final, something that had been holding me together with thin, fraying threads, now severed with a clean, effortless slice. I didn't move, didn't make a scene, didn't storm across the yard to demand an explanation, because I already knew there wasn't one. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something they would look back on and regret. This was deliberate. This was the way it had always been. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the back gate, I heard my mother's voice behind me, soft and gentle in that way that had always been so effective at making me question my own anger, making me wonder if I was being unreasonable, making me doubt whether or not I had the right to feel the way I did. "Rachel, honey, don't leave yet," she said, stepping toward me, her hands reaching out as if she wanted to keep me there, as if she thought that a light touch on my arm would be enough to undo everything. "I know this has been a lot, but you should be happy for your brother, not jealous." I blinked slowly, my body stilling, my breath steadying, my fingers curling around the strap of my purse as I turned to face her, the final piece of the puzzle snapping into place. They didn't just expect me to accept what had happened. They expected me to be grateful that Eric had been given something I had worked for. They expected me to smile, to celebrate, to put aside any feelings of resentment or loss or frustration because, in their eyes, his happiness mattered more than mine. I exhaled, long and slow, the last of my patience slipping away, the last of my willingness to play along with this game dissolving into something harder, something sharper, something completely and utterly unmovable. I nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, my lips curving into something that almost looked like a smile, but wasn't. "Of course," I said, my voice even, steady, almost too calm. "I'm happy for him." And I was. I was happy for him, because he had no idea what was coming next. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a weighted blanket, pressing against my skin as I sat at my dining table, staring at the stack of documents in front of me. The lamp above cast a dim, golden glow across the papers, the ink crisp and undeniable, the words staring back at me like an unspoken truth I had somehow forgotten. My name was right there, clear as day, printed in bold letters across the top of the deed, the legal confirmation that the house, my house, belonged to me and no one else. My parents had acted as though their decision had been final, as though their words alone had the power to rewrite reality, as though their approval was all that had ever mattered. But the law didn't work that way. The ink on this contract didn't care about family politics, didn't care about favoritism, didn't care about their absurd belief that my brother was somehow more entitled to my generosity simply because he had reproduced. A slow, steady calm settled over me, cooling the fire that had been burning inside my chest for days, replacing the heat of anger with something far more dangerous: certainty. There was no hesitation as I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts with deliberate intent, finding the name I had only used a handful of times in my life, but had never been more grateful for. The phone barely rang twice before a familiar voice answered, sharp, professional, efficient as always. "Rachel, it's late," my lawyer said, the faint rustle of papers in the background making it clear that she had probably been working late into the night. "What's going on?" I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against the edge of the table, grounding myself in the weight of what I was about to do. "I need to make some changes," I said, my voice even, measured, carrying none of the raw emotion that had been consuming me for days. Effective immediately. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating furiously against my nightstand, the screen lighting up with an endless flood of messages, each one more frantic than the last. Eric's name appeared over and over again, his text shifting from confusion to irritation to outright fury, the words slamming into my screen like bullets. "What the hell is this?" "Rachel, I'm at the house. There's a notice on the door. Call me now. You can't just take this back. It's already ours." I smirked, stretching lazily as I scrolled through his increasingly desperate messages, my body sinking deeper into the soft embrace of my silk sheets, completely unbothered by the fact that his entire world had just come crashing down. I had given them days to acknowledge what they had done, had given them every opportunity to show even the slightest bit of remorse, but instead, they had paraded around like kings and queens, basking in their undeserved prize, fully convinced that I would just accept my place as the ever-forgiving, ever-sacrificing sibling who never demanded anything for herself. They had never even considered the possibility that I might fight back. A few minutes later, another message popped up, this time from Megan, her words practically dripping with the kind of entitled outrage that had always made my skin crawl. Rachel, this is beyond petty. Do you have any idea how much time we've spent planning around this house? Do you realize how selfish you're being? Selfish. That was the word they always used when I refused to let them walk all over me. Selfish for not rolling over. Selfish for not sacrificing my own happiness for their convenience. Selfish for finally putting myself first. I tossed my phone onto the bed, sighing in quiet satisfaction as I stood up, stretching out the last remnants of sleep before making my way to the kitchen, humming softly to myself as I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I could almost picture it, could see the moment Eric had arrived at the house that morning, Megan probably sitting in the passenger seat, their kids chattering in the back, all of them expecting to step inside and begin the process of making my home their own. I imagined the confusion on Eric's face as he approached the front door, the way his brow had furrowed when he noticed the legal notice taped to the wood, the way his expression had shifted to sheer disbelief as he read the words that shattered whatever illusion of entitlement he had built in his head. The house was no longer his, because it never had been. A few hours later, my mother's number flashed across my screen, her call coming in right on schedule, just as predictable as the sun rising in the east. I let it ring twice before answering, pressing the phone to my ear as I leaned back against the kitchen counter, taking a slow sip of coffee, waiting for the inevitable. "What have you done?" Her voice was sharp, edged with something that might have been anger, but beneath it, I could hear the underlying current of disbelief, the stunned realization that, for the first time, their decisions hadn't been the final word. I let the silence stretch, let her stew in the moment, let her feel the weight of the power she had so carelessly assumed she still held over me. And then, with all the ease in the world, I answered. I took back what was mine. There was a long pause, the kind that spoke volumes, the kind that carried the weight of everything she wanted to say but couldn't because deep down she knew there was nothing she could do. "You didn't have to do this," she finally said, her voice softer now, carefully measured, shifting into the tone she always used when she was trying to manipulate me into seeing things her way. "You could have talked to us. You could have worked something out." I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, the kind of smile that felt like victory. "Funny," I mused, swirling my coffee absently, watching the steam curl into the air. "I don't remember anyone offering to work something out with me when you decided to give my house away." Another pause, longer this time, heavier, filled with the kind of unspoken truths that had always lived between us. "Rachel." I ended the call before she could finish, my patience spent, my energy too valuable to waste on conversations that would never lead anywhere. The past week had been a lesson, a brutal, necessary reminder that the only person who was ever going to look out for me was me. And I had learned that lesson well. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed, my lips curving as I pressed the call button, waiting for the smooth, professional voice on the other end. "Yes, hello," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "I'd like to put a house on the market." The sale happened faster than I expected, almost as if the universe itself had been waiting for me to finally make the right decision, to finally put myself first, to finally stop clinging to the idea that my family would ever see me as anything more than a supporting character in their story. Within 48 hours of listing the house, I had 3 serious buyers lined up, each one offering well over the asking price, each one eager to secure a home that was not only breathtaking but also situated in one of the most desirable areas in the state. The realtor had been thrilled, her voice practically buzzing through the phone as she listed out the details of the final offers, her excitement a stark contrast to the absolute fury I knew was brewing within my family. By the time I signed the closing documents, transferring ownership to a lovely retired couple from out of state who had been searching for their dream vacation home, I felt nothing but satisfaction, a deep, undeniable sense of justice settling in my bones. Every step of this process had been a deliberate reclaiming of my own worth, a statement that I was no longer willing to be the person who sacrificed while everyone else took without hesitation. I had spent years being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who was expected to give without asking for anything in return, but not anymore. This time, I was the one who took something back, the one who changed the rules, the one who refused to play their game. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. I had barely left the notary's office when my phone erupted with notifications, the messages coming in rapid succession, each one more hysterical than the last. Eric's name flashed across my screen first, his words practically screaming through the pixels, the sheer disbelief evident in every sentence. "You sold a house? Are you out of your mind? You knew we were moving in next week. What the hell is wrong with you? Mom and Dad are furious. You better fix this." The sheer entitlement dripping from his words made me laugh, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed in the quiet of my car as I scrolled through his texts, completely unbothered by his outrage. The absolute audacity of a man who had accepted my home as if it had always belonged to him, who had never once considered that he was taking something that was never meant to be his, who had believed so completely in the idea that his needs would always outweigh mine. It was almost impressive in a sick, twisted way. And then, right on cue, my father's name appeared on my screen, his call coming through with the same relentless persistence as a storm that refused to pass. I considered ignoring it, considered letting him stew in his own anger the way I had stewed in my own betrayal, but something in me, some final thread of closure I didn't even realize I needed, made me answer. The moment I picked up, his voice exploded through the speaker, his usual composed demeanor completely shattered by sheer, unfiltered rage. "Rachel, what the hell have you done?" he demanded, his voice thick with the kind of authority he had always assumed would make me fall in line, the same voice that had dictated my childhood, the same voice that had expected me to obey without question. "You had no right to do this. That house was supposed to stay in the family." I leaned back in my seat, a slow smile curving at the edges of my lips as I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer than necessary, letting him feel, if only for a second, the exact kind of helplessness I had felt when they had taken my gift and handed it to someone else. "Actually," I said, my tone calm, collected, perfectly measured. "I had every right. The deed was in my name, remember? That means I could do whatever I wanted with it. And I did." There was a beat of stunned silence, the kind that spoke volumes, the kind that told me he had never expected me to push back, had never considered that I might actually take control, had never once believed that I would be the one dictating how this ended. And then, just as I had anticipated, the accusations began. "This is spiteful," he spat, his voice raw with frustration, his words carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who had just realized he had lost. "This is you being childish and vindictive because you didn't get your way. Do you even care how this makes our family look?" I exhaled slowly, my fingers tapping idly against the steering wheel, letting the words roll off me like water, unaffected, untouched, completely indifferent to his desperate attempts to make me feel guilty. "I just did what you taught me," I finally said, my voice deceptively light, carrying the kind of dangerous calm that sent a clear message. I was done playing nice. I gave it to someone who actually deserves it. His sharp inhale was the only response I needed, the exact confirmation that my words had landed exactly where I wanted them to. I ended the call before he could say anything else, before he could launch into another attempt at manipulation, before he could twist the situation into something that made me the villain, before he could try to guilt me into regretting a decision I had never felt more sure of. I stared at my phone for a brief moment, watching as more messages flooded in, each one more desperate than the last, each one screaming for me to undo what had already been set in stone. But I was already moving forward. Instead of responding, instead of wasting another second of my time trying to explain myself to people who had never once considered my feelings, I did something else. I opened my travel app, scrolled through the most extravagant destinations in the world, and with the same ruthless efficiency I had used to sell that house, I booked the most luxurious vacation of my life. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, private villas with infinity pools overlooking oceans so blue they looked unreal. They had taken what was mine and given it away without hesitation, but now, for the first time in my life, I was taking something back. The next morning, as I boarded the plane, the soft hum of first-class luxury surrounding me. I lifted my glass of champagne to my lips, savoring the crisp, delicate taste as I stared out at the world below. Let them be angry. Let them be shocked. Let them finally understand what it felt like to be discarded, to be treated as an afterthought, to be reminded that not everything belongs to them just because they want it. For the first time in years, I felt something settle deep in my chest, something solid, something unshakable, something that tasted a hell of a lot like freedom. And it was delicious. The first morning of my vacation was perfect, the kind of perfection that settles deep into your bones, soothing old wounds and silencing voices that have spent years whispering that you don't deserve to put yourself first. The air smelled like salt and citrus, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the golden light of the sunrise, and my only concern was deciding whether to start my day with a long swim or another mimosa. The crisp linen sheets of my suite still held the warmth of my skin as I stretched out across the oversized bed, relishing the rare luxury of waking up without the weight of obligation pressing down on me. I had spent so many years chasing approval, bending over backward to make everyone else's life easier, constantly reminding myself that family comes first, even when I was treated as nothing more than an afterthought. But not today. Today, I came first. As I reached for my phone, ready to scroll through a list of spa treatments I had booked for myself, the screen lit up with an avalanche of notifications, the sheer number of missed calls and unread messages so ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud. It was almost funny how quickly they had gone from dismissing my existence to demanding my attention, as if my silence had created some unbearable vacuum they couldn't handle. For days, they had barely noticed I was gone, but now that my absence came with consequences, they couldn't stop screaming my name. The first message I opened was from Megan, her words so predictably entitled that I had to read them twice just to fully absorb the sheer audacity of what she was saying. How could you be so selfish, Rachel? We were counting on that house, and now you've made everything harder for us. Do you even care how much stress this has caused? I stared at my phone, shaking my head as a slow, bitter smile curled at the edges of my lips. Selfish. That word again, the same one they had always used to keep me in line, the same accusation they had thrown at me every time I dared to prioritize myself over their endless, insatiable needs. Megan wasn't upset because they had lost something that rightfully belonged to them. She was upset because, for once, I had refused to be used. I didn't even bother responding before opening the next message, this one from Eric, his tone less manipulative but twice as desperate, his ego clearly shattered beyond repair by the public fallout of his own arrogance. You had no right to do this, Rachel. You humiliated me. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this has been? My coworkers all knew about the house, and now I look like a complete joke. You couldn't have just let it go. I rolled my eyes, sinking deeper into the plush pillows behind me, taking my time with each sip of my drink, savoring the knowledge that Eric was finally experiencing a fraction of the humiliation he had expected me to accept without protest. He hadn't cared how it felt when he stole what was mine, hadn't given a second thought to how casually he had dismissed me, how easily he had accepted something he never deserved. But now that the world had seen him stumble, now that his perfect little image had a crack in it, suddenly, I was the villain. I let out a slow breath, tapping my fingers against the rim of my glass, wondering if I should finally say something, if I should give them the satisfaction of a response, if I should remind them of just how deeply they had underestimated me. But before I could even decide, another call came through, my mother's name flashing across the screen, a familiar tightness settling in my chest as I debated whether or not I had the patience to listen to whatever version of emotional manipulation she had prepared. I hesitated for a moment before answering, letting the silence stretch between us, waiting for her to speak first, waiting for her to show her hand before I decided how to play mine. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft, careful, carefully rehearsed, the same tone she had always used when she wanted me to bend without realizing I was breaking. "Sweetheart," she said, exhaling like she was carrying the weight of the world, like I was the one who had hurt her, like she was some tragic victim of circumstances beyond her control. "We didn't mean to hurt you. You know that, right?" I swallowed the laugh threatening to rise in my throat, because of course that was her angle. Of course she was going to pretend this was all just some unfortunate misunderstanding. Of course she was going to act like I was being dramatic for reacting exactly the way any rational person would. I could have exploded. I could have screamed every single thing I had been holding back for years. I could have listed every moment, every insult, every time I had been expected to shrink myself to fit inside their selfish little world. But instead, I chose precision over destruction, clarity over chaos, truth over theatrics. You didn't think about me at all, I said, my voice quiet, steady, unshakable. She inhaled sharply, the kind of breath that comes when someone has been hit exactly where it hurts, the kind of silence that follows a truth too undeniable to refute. Rachel, honey, please, she said, her voice softer now, like she was pleading with a wounded animal, like she thought if she sounded sad enough, I would forget everything they had done. You don't have to cut us off over this. Just come home. We'll fix things together. We'll figure it out. We're still family. Family. That word used to mean something to me, used to hold weight, used to be the thing that kept me tethered, the thing that made me swallow my own pain, the thing that made me stay when I should have left. But now, it just felt empty. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen for a long, quiet moment before my fingers moved without hesitation, blocking every single number. The moment I pressed the final button, the tension in my chest dissolved, something inside me clicking into place, something final, something irreversible. I had spent my entire life being the one who held everything together, but now I was letting it all fall apart. As I set my phone aside, the ocean breeze brushing against my skin, the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore, I realized that for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely and utterly free. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of my suite, casting soft golden streaks across the pristine marble floors, the kind of glow that made everything feel serene, effortless, untouched by the chaos I had left behind. The distant hum of a bustling Italian street carried through the slightly open balcony doors, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses floating up from the cafe below, a stark contrast to the absolute disaster that was undoubtedly unfolding back home. I stretched lazily against the silk sheets, reaching for my phone only because I wanted to see the time, not because I expected any messages. I had already blocked all the usual suspects, cut the ties that once kept me bound to a family that never thought twice about discarding me when it suited them. But as I tapped the screen, a familiar name popped up at the top of my notifications, one I hadn't blocked, one I hadn't even considered in the middle of all this madness. Aunt Lisa. For a long moment, I just stared at the name, my finger hovering over the screen, debating whether or not I even wanted to hear whatever piece of secondhand family drama she was about to deliver. Lisa had always been the only member of my family who never made me feel like I was some kind of lesser version of a daughter, the only person who had ever pulled me aside during family gatherings and whispered things like, "I see how they treat you, honey, and it isn't right." She had never been loud about it, never openly challenged my parents or my brother, but she had always been aware, always given me that knowing look when my mother conveniently forgot to include me in her stories, or when my father spent an entire dinner praising Eric's accomplishments while ignoring mine entirely. With a sigh, I unlocked my phone and opened the message, already knowing that whatever she had to say, it was going to be messy. "Rachel, I know you don't want to hear this, and I debated even reaching out, but I thought you might want to know, your parents are absolutely devastated. Not because they regret what they did, not because they feel bad for how they treated you, but because Eric is furious with them. He's blaming them for losing the house, saying they should have made you sign it over before you had the chance to sell it. Your dad tried to defend himself, but you know how Eric is when he doesn't get what he wants. Now he's saying they let him down, that they should have done more, that he deserved the house and they failed him. Honestly, Rachel, it's a mess. Your mother is crying, your father is shouting, and Eric is refusing to speak to either of them until they fix it. Just thought you'd like to know." I stared at the message, my lips curving into a slow, almost disbelieving smile, my eyes scanning over the words again just to fully appreciate the absolute absurdity of the situation. It wasn't enough that Eric had tried to take what wasn't his. It wasn't enough that my parents had eagerly handed it to him like it was their decision to make. It was the fact that even after all of that, even after losing, even after watching his perfect little plan collapse right in front of him, Eric still somehow believed he was the victim. It was almost impressive in a way, the sheer delusional entitlement it took to not only believe you were owed something you never earned, but to also blame everyone else when it was taken away. I leaned back against the plush headboard, exhaling a slow, content sigh, taking a moment to let it all sink in, to truly appreciate the poetic justice of it all. The family that had spent years treating me like an afterthought, like a footnote in their grand narrative, was now turning on itself, unraveling under the weight of their own selfishness, their own expectations, their own deeply ingrained belief that Eric's needs always came first. And me? I was sitting in a five-star hotel in Italy, sipping an obscenely expensive glass of champagne while they tore each other apart over a house that was never theirs to begin with. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel anything but absolute satisfaction. I picked up my phone again, my fingers moving over the screen with effortless precision as I typed a short, deliberate response, one that carried none of the anger, none of the pain, none of the years of resentment they had expected me to hold on to. Karma works fast, huh? I hit send and set my phone down, picking up my champagne flute, swirling the golden liquid before taking a slow, indulgent sip, savoring the taste of victory. Somewhere back home, my parents were probably sitting in their living room, staring at the phone in stunned silence, realizing for the first time that they had raised a monster. Not in me, but in Eric, the golden child, the one they had spent their whole lives protecting, the one they had showered with love and praise while expecting me to quietly fade into the background. For the first time in their lives, they were facing the reality they had created, the son they had enabled beyond reason, the son who was now punishing them for not securing his unearned prize. And the best part? I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to fight for justice. I didn't have to convince them of their wrongdoing. I didn't have to argue or beg for them to see my worth. The truth had unfolded all on its own, revealing itself in the form of their own guilt, their own failure, their own blind devotion to a man who had never once appreciated them beyond what they could give him. I took another sip of champagne, letting the bubbles fizzle against my tongue, my entire body relaxing into the warmth of the Italian sun spilling through the windows. Let them fight. Let them tear each other apart trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Let them finally feel what it's like to be on the losing side of a decision that was never theirs to make. Because for once in my life, I wasn't cleaning up their mess. I wasn't coming home to fix it. I was exactly where I belonged. Weeks had passed since I sold the house, since I blocked their numbers, since I had walked away from a family that had spent a lifetime making me feel like an afterthought. I had spent that time exactly the way I wanted, exploring ancient cities, dining in candlelit restaurants, drinking wines so smooth it felt like velvet on my tongue, waking up every morning without a single obligation to anyone but myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations, wasn't twisting myself into something smaller just to fit into the role they had written for me without my permission. It had taken years for me to realize that I had never actually been part of this family in the way that mattered, that I had only ever been the backup plan, the reliable one, the one they could count on to sacrifice when it was convenient, the one who was supposed to understand when they decided that Eric deserved more because, in their eyes, I had never deserved much at all. When the invitation came, a vague text from my mother that read, "Can we talk over dinner? Just us. No fighting." I almost ignored it, almost deleted it without a second thought, almost let it fade into the background noise of all the other messages they had tried to send before realizing I wasn't going to answer. But something inside me, something calm and unshaken, told me that this wasn't about seeking closure or mending what was broken. It was about finally telling them the truth to their faces, letting them sit in the reality they had created, making them hear the words they had spent years pretending didn't exist. So I agreed, not because I wanted reconciliation, not because I missed them, not because I needed their approval, but because for the first time, I was walking into this conversation as the one with nothing to lose. The restaurant they chose was one of their favorites, a quiet little place they had been going to for years, the kind of restaurant that made it impossible to raise your voice, where waiters moved silently between tables, where everything was softened by warm lighting and the sound of gentle conversation. It was the perfect setting for them to pretend that everything was normal, the kind of place where they expected I would sit down, smile politely, and agree to smooth things over for the sake of keeping the peace. But I wasn't here for peace. I was here for the truth. They were already seated when I arrived, my father looking stiff and uncomfortable, my mother fidgeting with a napkin in her lap, her lips pressed together in the kind of forced, strained smile that told me she had rehearsed exactly what she was going to say. There was a brief flicker of something unreadable in her expression when she saw me. Maybe surprise, maybe regret, or maybe just the realization that I no longer carried the weight of their approval like a chain around my neck. I sat down without hesitation, without apology, without the slightest inclination to ease the tension they were clearly drowning in. My mother was the first to speak, her voice carefully even, her words chosen with the kind of precision that only came from someone who knew they were on the losing side of a battle they had never expected to fight. "Rachel, sweetheart," she began, her tone almost soothing, as if she were trying to guide me towards some inevitable conclusion. "We don't want this tension anymore. We don't want you to feel like you're not part of this family." I laughed before I could stop myself, a quiet, humorless sound that made my father's jaw tighten and my mother's face falter, her carefully composed expression slipping just for a moment. "That's funny," I said, tilting my head slightly, letting my gaze sweep between them. "Because I was never part of this family, not really. I was just the backup plan." Silence. A long, thick silence that neither of them seemed to know how to fill, as if they had expected anything but this, as if they had convinced themselves that all I needed was an apology, a few carefully chosen words, and I would fall right back into place, right back into the role I had been given. "Rachel, that's not fair," my father finally said, his voice edged with frustration, with the kind of defensive authority he had always used to shut down conversations he didn't want to have. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be. The house, it wasn't about excluding you. We thought." I cut him off before he could finish, before he could try to twist this into something it wasn't, before he could pretend that this was a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate, calculated erasure of my place in this family. "You gave him my gift," I said simply, my voice steady, controlled, razor-sharp in its finality. "So I gave it to myself instead." More silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, that I could practically hear the weight of my words crashing into them, tearing through the last flimsy excuse they had tried to cling to, forcing them to confront what they had done without the safety of denial. My mother's eyes darted toward my father, as if waiting for him to say something, to fix it, to bring this conversation back into a place she knew how to navigate. But my father, for once in his life, had nothing to say. I let out a slow breath, leaning back in my chair, feeling the last traces of obligation melt away, feeling the weight of a lifetime of waiting for their approval lift off my shoulders like smoke disappearing into the air. "You only care now because I walked away," I said, my voice quiet, final, unshakable in its certainty. "You didn't care when you took what was mine. You didn't care when you told me I didn't need it. You didn't care when Eric moved in and acted like I never existed. But now? Now that it's gone? Now that I made my choice? Now that I refuse to let you decide my worth? Now, suddenly, you want to fix things?" Neither of them responded. Neither of them could respond. I reached for my purse, pulling a few bills from my wallet, placing them neatly on the table before rising to my feet, feeling nothing but relief as I looked at them one last time, knowing that this moment belonged to me, not them. "You can stop pretending now," I said, my tone light, almost amused, as I turned to leave. This family was never mine to begin with. And just like that, I walked away. Not angry, not bitter, not broken, just done. The weight of the moment pressed heavily against the air, thick with the kind of silence that only follows the irreversible, the undeniable, the moment where everything that has been ignored or excused or brushed aside finally demands to be reckoned with. My mother sat across from me, her carefully composed facade beginning to crack, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap, her eyes darting between my father and me, as if silently pleading for him to say something, to fix this, to somehow undo what had already been written in stone. My father, the man who had always spoken with an air of absolute authority, sat stone-faced, his mouth pressed into a thin, grim line, his hands clenched into tight fists against the polished wood of the table, his silence saying more than any attempt at justification ever could. I had said everything I needed to say, had laid out every unspoken truth, had forced them to sit with the reality they had spent years refusing to acknowledge. There was no need to shout, no need for anger, no need for dramatic accusations or wild declarations, because they already knew. They had always known. They had just assumed that I would never be brave enough to make them face it, that I would never walk away, that I would always, inevitably, find my way back into the space they had assigned me, grateful for whatever scraps of love and acceptance they were willing to give. But they had been wrong. I rose to my feet with a calmness that didn't need performance, didn't need validation, didn't need permission, my movements slow and deliberate, the final act of a conversation that had never really been a conversation at all, but rather a closing statement, a full stop at the end of a story I was no longer interested in reading. I watched as my mother's breath hitched, as her hands trembled just slightly against the linen napkin, as she struggled to pull together the right words, the ones that she had always used to smooth things over, to make me doubt myself, to convince me that whatever pain I felt was just an overreaction, a misunderstanding, something that could be talked through if only I would be reasonable. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile in a way I had never heard before, as if even she knew that this was different, that this wasn't something she could just explain away. "We didn't mean to hurt you." The words sat there between us, heavy and weightless all at once, floating in the charged space that separated us, the last attempt at justification, at damage control, at salvaging whatever could still be salvaged. For a brief moment, I let myself consider the past, the years spent trying to earn a place at a table that had never truly been set for me, the childhood spent being the reliable one, the understanding one, the one who was expected to watch silently as Eric was handed more and more, the one who was supposed to swallow every slight, every dismissal, every casual betrayal, because that's just how things were. I thought about the holidays where I had spent hours picking out the perfect gifts for my parents, for my brother, only to be met with absent-minded thanks, while Eric's children received applause for their crayon drawings and lopsided handmade cards. I thought about the countless times I had rearranged my schedule, changed my plans, dropped everything to accommodate them, never once being met with the same consideration in return. I thought about the moment they had taken my gift of love and gratitude, the house that I had bought with them in mind, and had handed it away without a second thought, as if I had never been part of the decision at all. I smiled then, slow and quiet, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, the kind of smile that held no warmth, no softness, no invitation for further conversation. It wasn't bitter, wasn't mocking, wasn't cruel. It was simply the last goodbye. "I know," I said, my voice steady, unwavering, carrying none of the sadness they had been expecting, none of the regret they had been hoping to hear. "That's what makes it worse." My father's head jerked slightly, as if he hadn't expected those words, as if he had been prepared for an argument, a breakdown, an emotional outburst that he could dismiss, something that he could counter with logic, with authority, with condescension. But this was something he didn't know how to fight. I didn't wait for a response, didn't linger to see the way my mother's face crumbled, didn't give them the chance to try again, to reshape the narrative into something that made them feel better about what they had done. Instead, I turned and walked away, stepping out of that restaurant, out of their carefully controlled reality, out of a family that had never truly been mine. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel the need to say anything else. By the time I returned to my hotel suite, the lights of the city stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the world outside humming with the quiet energy of a life that had nothing to do with me, I felt something settle inside me, something solid, unshakable, untouchable. I poured myself a drink, watching the golden liquid swirl in the glass, the ice clinking softly against the sides, and let out a slow, steady breath, realizing that I had never felt so free. The best revenge wasn't anger, wasn't screaming, wasn't demanding apologies that would never be sincere, wasn't trying to make them understand something they'd spent a lifetime refusing to see. The best revenge was knowing that I no longer needed them, that I had given them my love, my patience, my kindness, and when they had shown me exactly how little it meant to them, I had taken it back. They had lost me. And for the first time, I knew they were the ones who would feel the weight of that loss, not me. I lifted my glass, taking a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through me, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a battle won without ever needing to fight. No more apologies. No more explanations. No more waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself.